How appropriate. How are you all involved?
Do you want to do?
Yeah.
So I'm Carlos. I was one of you.
Oh yes, thank you, Charles.
And you're the.
I'm the co-chair of the committee.
Oh, okay. So this would be equivalent of GAPA, right? Similar. Yeah.
I'm Jason, Blue, because there's multiple, and I'm one of the cultural local chairs of the committee.
I'm also a member.
We met a couple times in the past. I'm at API playing with flag.
Okay.
I'm Kevin, and I'm also just a member.
I'm James, also cultural local chair.
When did you guys decide to do that? Cool chair. I really like it.
It's good.
Yeah.
The role evolves with the times and the leadership.
Not that other
Good.
Because it's not usual that people would say, "Oh, I want to do politics," especially for SAPs.
I'm that girl.
Yeah. That's what I'm curious to see why you decided to do that. Like why?
What? Oh,
Yeah,
yeah,
why?
you're asking me?
Yeah.
It's just like I'm like angry and I'm like the people that people want to frame as the angry minority, and I just like reclaim that. Like have like a lot of left positions and wanted to influence the sort of community from that angle and in this position. And Jason's much like that.
Cool.
I'm Bruce, member of
Jason, member of
Albert is a member as well.
Not just a member, right? Is there
paying member.
Sure.
General member.
And do you have regular ongoing events as well too?
Yeah, so we have, we host a bunch of social events, so we have a bi-monthly mixer that happens on the second and fourth Fridays of every month at Foster's Kitchen. We also have periodic tea gatherings, and then we also have a series of, currently we're doing a series of political education general meetings, so we gather a bunch of people, and we basically talk about something political. Like most recently, we did something on policing and the criminal justice system, which happened on Saturday. I wasn't there, but some of these members were.
Okay.
Yeah, it was pretty good. Yeah. I'm Kevin. I'm the communications chair.
Kevin?
Yeah.
So how old is the organization?
We've been around since 1990. Yeah.
It's a year from
That's quick.
Yeah.
And due to was there some kind of uprising or just APIs wanted to have a voice? This is pretty much yes.
Yeah. Queer. Yes.
And is there an annual like a big event like a runway equivalent?
No.
It's really fun. Jason, you're on it.
It's different here.
What do you mean?
No runway, no banquet.
Oh, nothing.
We used to have one in the past. Yeah, so there's nobody wants to do it.
Oh, okay. So maybe this group here can figure out that's what you'll be doing. Like, yes, we're gonna do that. It's actually like a really big community thing.
Okay, so let's just get like formally like started here. So I have like a little agenda. I'll just lay out how the night's gonna go a little bit. So we have a little introduction of Evan Law. You can say a few words about what you do and stuff like that. I'll talk a little bit about GAPIMNY, talk about like our political positions. We'll have a little discussion, and then everyone else can participate in a Q&A afterwards. So just a little bit about Evan Lowe. Evan Lowe was elected to the California State Assembly in November 2014 to represent District 28, which encompasses parts of Silicon Valley and South Bay. At the age of 31, Assemblymember Lowe became the youngest Asian American legislator to have been elected to the Assembly in state history. Lowe chairs the Business and Professions Committee as well as the California Legislative LGBT Caucus. And in 2015, together with Assemblymember Ian Calderon, he launched the first state California Legislative Technology and Innovation Caucus. So I'll leave the floor to you to
Well, actually, I came to, if it fits within your format, I don't want to disturb or disrupt your, okay. But one of the things that we do in the state legislature is try to protect individuals from various communities. And part of that conversation as chair of the LGBT Legislative Caucus, sort of just by way of background, we have a record number of 8 openly LGBT legislators in the state of California, in the state legislature. That's more openly gay legislators than any other state in the nation. And we're very diverse with Latinas, a really tall Jewish guy from San Francisco. We still yet have to get an African American openly LGBT, and millennials and API. But part of that conversation that we see in the LGBT movement is the lack of diversity, even amongst our movement. And being here, I'm spending some time in DC and here in New York to try and get ideas and to also listen and to get an opportunity to build additional partnerships for the things that we care about. I said earlier in CAPI, I think Jason, who else was there? So I said during during the conference that it was very well known that you have different groups that are marching. Every single group marches, from mainstream LGBT to women's groups to March for Our Lives on firearms, on Latinos, those are the undocumented, Black Lives Matter. And then when you say for API communities, just in general, what does the general API community go out in the streets and march for? It's difficult to find something like that. Like, what do we galvanize for? What do we go out and march for? And there's, I don't know, what do you see anything? Where it's just like solely APIs going marching for something? And in my experience, when we did see Asian responders protest outside my office, for example, it was against affirmative action. And it's this very protectionist view that now that we have it, we shouldn't allow others to have it. And this context to say that actually Asian responders benefited from affirmative action, so let's tell you about this. And there was something called a white flight in many communities that we served in that allowed for this opportunity for you to be comfortable speaking your native language and not being persecuted or harassed. So we have an obligation to make sure that these communities have intersectionality together. And that's why I was heartened to see the existence of this organization to go say, what is our obligation as Asian responders within the LGBT community? And then from that vantage point, what is our role to the wider lens of civic engagement and holding our public officials accountable? What do gay AAPI care about? And what do we ask for and what do we demand? And these are the critical components that I think are really important to try and do. And it's been something that I try to bridge as an individual. There's not too many openly API LGBT individuals sort of in my neck of the woods or in the work that we do within the realm of politics or government. And I found myself trying to build a bridge between more conservative Asians, traditional Asians, when we push forth LGBT legislation, Korean churches, and mainland Chinese are being busloaded up to the state capitol to oppose a bill that had on conversion therapy. So it is a collective effort. So I very much would welcome your input and insights to understand, for example, why you spent your time today on a Thursday to be here, part of an organization like this, and saying, well, what is it about this? Because I would suggest that it's my observation that you are not the norm, when in fact our numbers don't reflect the type of engagement that we see, not just in the electoral, but just in visibility as well too. So that is something that I try to continually advocate for, and would very much value your insights as to what you are seeing and why things are important to you, and what we can collectively do to have this wider conversation as a partnership. So, having said that, I ask, why is it that you chose to be part of an organization when the vast majority, for example, of my friends do not participate, and rather they would just, be on social media and they'll just repost something, and that's their, okay, that's my duty, that is my duty, but then rather you're continually here. And Jason goes from Java all the way to the other coast and is still active in this organization. Like, what is it that, you're talking earlier about being angry, or feeling a sense of obligation. What is it about our democracy and our society now that you feel like there's not being adequately addressed for us as the API in the LGBT space, or just in general?
I think part of it is the issues that affect our communities, specific to our identities, also affect all communities, right? So if we're talking about issues with economic inequality, if we're talking about immigrant justice issues, language access, that affects communities across the board. And so the same issues that affect Asian Americans or LGBT folks are the same issues that affect Black folks and Native Americans and so forth. We're talking about climate change, things like that. And so it's not to say that we all experience these issues in the same way, and some communities are more impacted than others. But I think for us, we share a lot of the same concerns that other marginalized communities experience. And I think also, Asian Americans and LGBTQ folks are diverse communities, and there's also a lot of privilege that exists within these spaces. And so for us as McKinney, I think, we want to help bring people into the fold of getting politically organized and being able to make demands, but also thinking about how can we leverage the power and privilege and use that responsibly. And so that's, I think, a big part of what we try to do in terms of working with other communities as well as engaging our communities.
Yeah. And then as political co-chair, right? Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like the engagement from public representatives, they recognize the importance of the community and understand what the needs are?
I don't want to talk too much. I think politics takes on different forms. It doesn't always have to be through our engagement with elected officials, but I do think that's obviously a really important piece of it. And so I think the Democratic Party has a lot of work to do, and obviously the Republican Party has a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
And so I think we're interested in engaging politics in that sense, but also thinking more broadly about what political power looks like. And so, yeah.
Anybody else have any thoughts or insights that might be willing to share, with respect to the citizens of the place we're right now?
I just think that one thing that you said, that you were sort of acting as a bridge between the more conservative elements of the Asian community, and I think that's part of the reason I'm here, because a lot of us have had experiences growing up, coming out in those communities, and we want to make it better for other people to have a better experience possibly. And I think the best way, we're sort of the best ambassadors for our identity and our issues to our parents and that generation, or to the new immigrants who are coming from parts of Asia where it's still legal, sodomies, there's still anti-sodomy laws in Asia. And it's that face-to-face interaction and whatever marketing of political campaigns, that we could have more visibility in any area. It starts changing people's minds, and that starts changing people's perceptions, and sort of slowly, their views on certain issues, maybe on even other related issues.
Yeah. Have you found that, is that a similar experience here with more conservative Asians, more traditional, maybe older or recent immigrants? Is that also a common viewpoint here?
Yeah.
So actually, I was living in Taiwan for the last 4 years, and we were actually there. A friend of mine actually, I think, met you. But so coming back to New York, I think what is interesting is, I grew up in America, but I think I come with almost a sort of skepticism sometimes, because I think a lot of the dialogue in America is very much rooted in America, which it's almost not logical, but I think it,
that's what I sort of am challenged with. We also, as I mentioned, we had 8 openly LGBT legislators in the state of California. We also have 15 AAPI legislators in the state of California. That's a record number that we've ever had, and it's the largest in any other state legislature. But of course, when we sit down, I'll tell you very candidly, when we sit down and we talk about the issues that we prioritize, we say, what is the specific issue that the Asian Pacific Islander Caucus is going to prioritize and champion and make sure that we fight for, other than just basic common issues like education. But if you said, for example, the LGBT Caucus, you know what the LGBT Caucus is going to stand for, and you know what the advocacy legislation is going to look like. You know what the Women's Caucus, pay equity, is going to look like. You know what the Black Caucus is going to stand for with respect to incarceration, recidivism, and criminal justice reform. The Latino community, you know what they stand for with respect to immigration reform and language access. Some of these issues certainly would have an impact on the Asian Pacific community as well too. But what was that key thing that, man, we're going to get Asians elected because we need this? And honestly, I've struggled to find out what that answer is. And yet I always talk about the obligations of making sure that we advocate for all of the other issues that we just talked about, that Asians should also care about criminal justice reform, and Asians should also care about universal health care, and that we should also care about housing, and all of these things. But yet, what is that defining issue? And if there is an absence of that defining issue, is there something more deeply seated that we have not really addressed or talked about, which is that of the distinction between Asian Pacific Islanders, that Chinese are very different from Laotians. Laotians are different from Koreans, and that what are the unique characteristics and needs? So, for example, we had a piece of legislation on disaggregated data with respect to education. In other words, you don't just lump all Asians in this category of within education, but that when you break it down, you see that, okay, other groups have greater needs than others within the Asian Pacific lens, then that's important to be able to do. Of course, I'll tell you, when we had this piece of legislation, it was in fact a vocal Chinese community who were actively in opposition to this piece of legislation of disaggregated data, many of them coming from mainland China, because they felt like this was the beginning to take away from them, which is to say that when you have the data that shows that, well, Laotians and Southeast Asians need more support than that of some others within the Asian Pacific lens, thereby more resources go to them, and that means taking away from the existing pool, which is actually not the case, and we should be expanding that pie. So that's where I feel conflict also in the obligations that we have to say, well, we need to be inclusive as a whole, and which why I think an organization like GAPIMNY helps to bridge that, and any ways that we can do that in our respective regions, but then nationally, I think would be helpful to that dialogue and conversation. What does it look like? What are the issues that we look like? Because as many of you probably are familiar aware of Wen Ho Lee, someone who was a scientist and was accused of being a Chinese spy, and or issues related to racist t-shirts and Abercrombie & Fitch. These are all areas of which I got involved in. Galvanize actually got more involved in politics because of the discrimination towards Asian Pacific Islanders before I got involved within the LGBT lens. But there's intersectionality, and that's why, again, I would value your input to say, okay, well, what does it look like? What are the needs of Asian Pacific Islanders that is like our core issue? And maybe I'm too stuck on this, like what is that one identifiable key core issue that we care about? But again, every other community has it. That core, you know what they stand for. But us, well, something that's not very protectionist, like, oh, protect our children from getting into good schools. What is that? And again, why do we get elected? Why do we elect Asian Pacific Islanders to public office? And in my world, why do we elect you for office? Because what do we need you for? Is it empty tokenism? Is it just for you to sit there and like, oh, there's an Asian, so we must be good? Well, what are we advocating for? So that's why I struggle, and again, I'm here to also listen and have dialogue to see what is it that there are issues that are important. Because when I go out throughout the state of California and I talk about these, we actually did a listening tour. Our Asian Pacific Islander Caucus did a listening tour throughout the entire state in different geographic regions. And there were specific issues, but there was not one unifying issue that came up continuously throughout the entire state. Whereas if we did it on a different hat, on the LGBT, it's pretty universal, and any other group is pretty universal. So
our sense of what is needed.
Yeah, so I mean, before that, I'll just talk about a little bit about our values and like what our organization stands for, which are also on our website. But like a short list is a commitment to anti-racism, anti-homophobia, anti-transphobia, solidarity with other people of color, especially the Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities, immigrant justice, especially in regards to the undocumented, economic justice, prioritizing those that are resource poor or working class, and inclusivity for everyone under the LGBTQ and API umbrella. So that's Pan-Asian, language inclusion, age inclusion, and more. Some stances that we've taken in the past year for affirmative action, we've actually signed the ALDEF's amicus brief that basically is in support of affirmative action. We have released a statement condemning the massacre of the Palestinian people by the state of Israel in May. We are against travel bans, of course. I mean, we have a history of being discriminated against.
But not against my travel ban, though. I had a travel ban for the state employee, public employees to travel to some of these states that discriminate based on sexual orientation. And of course, they said, oh, it's kind of ironic that you would be against travel bans, but yeah, I suppose. It's different. I understand the context.
Yeah. For immigration, we stand by immigrants from all countries, urge the support for the DREAM Act. We also stand against ICE, no family should be separated across border, and they also suggest and implement many policies that violate basic human rights. So that's like the quick rundown of like our stances. I know that you mentioned before about like affirmative action and how it's sort of like, it's definitely questioned a lot about like the Asian and the API community and I guess intersectionality and like can you speak a little bit more about like I guess how we as members within our community would interact with people who are more against like affirmative action? Can you speak more to that, I guess?
How do we have a conversation with people from our communities who are in opposition to affirmative action? I think part of the context is not understanding history. That why was affirmative action in place and who did it benefit? And that actually Asian Pacific Islanders benefited also similarly from affirmative action. And that we have also equally benefited from the women's rights movement and the civil rights movement from all communities, from farm workers to the LGBT to all. And so having that context is important. So at least in my experience, for example, when there was a Muslim ban, we had a Muslim ban, we had protests at SFO, San Francisco Airport, and I went. And I stood up and I said, where are my fellow Asian Pacific Islanders? And again, some of the conservative Chinese said, we're not Muslim, we don't do that. And I said, okay, let me tell you about history. There's something called the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, that these United States did the same thing in 1882, and yet we're doing it again in 2017, but another group, to another group. So people didn't necessarily know the contextual history to it, or that there was something called the Alien Land Law of 1912 in the state of California that prohibited Mongolians from owning property. Asian Pacific Islanders could not own in California. Asians could not own property in the state of California. So our history will repeat itself. But see, this is why education is so important too, because I remember as a product of public education, I could speak to you blue in the face on the civil rights movement, the Black community, from farm workers to women's rights, but I couldn't talk to you about my own AAPI American history. And yet my school district consists of over 40% Asian Pacific Islanders, the largest minority population. And yet there's this disservice. So when we talk about ethnic studies and incorporating that as a requirement or ensuring that other districts have this as an option, I think that's important because we're doing ourselves a disservice when we don't talk about our own American history. AAPI history is American history, and it's something that we need to make sure that's incorporated and institutionalized because so many of us become just numb, and or maybe it's happening to another group, so it doesn't really impact us. So if you are a heterosexual AAPI, and said, okay, women, not me, Latinos, I have my papers, Black Lives Matter, well, okay, that's not me, LGBT, I don't know any gay people. what is your obligation, what is your commitment? And that's where I think the historical context is helpful. Which is why we try to pass pieces of legislation and working with other communities on the ethnic studies piece to say that this is what we care about collectively. And in the state of California, when you add up all of the ethnic caucuses, the legislators who come from minority communities, it's a significant, it's significant voting bloc in which we stand together and say this is a caucus, Women's Caucus, Latino Caucus, Black Caucus, API Caucus, and LGBT Caucus, with all the legislators stand together, and here's what we're going to support. We're talking about against ICE and DACA and all these other issues.
Has your office been vocal in support of affirmative action or like visible on that issue?
Yes, there are two legislative offices that have been protested by mainland Chinese. One was mine, and then one was another member in San Gabriel Valley. That is a position that we have taken, and unfortunately, it's building that bridge. Of course, you see a lot of commonality on some of these people because these were the same individuals who protested on disaggregated data and who protested on conversion therapy. So it's a conservative group that they're saying, oh, they call themselves the Silicon Valley Chinese Association, and it's more an ideology than that sort of demographic. Although the local Chinese paper, or the Tsingtao paper, supported our Proposition 8, which eliminated the rights of same-sex couples to marry. So again, it's a work in progress.
I think it's really. Oh, sorry.
I just have something to say about affirmative action. So it does seem like mainland Chinese communities are like most against that. I think from our political education journal meeting last week, the Korean speaker, I'm sorry, but she said it's like very useful to sometimes look at the issue from their point of view and understand why they think that. And I think when I was living in China, there's like a similar issue with the civil examinations that all Chinese students have to take to get into college. Is like the only thing that matters in terms of your whole future. And the funny thing is, like, professors and like educators around China are actually really against it. They think it's too narrow of a metric. And it's the parents who are actually in support of it because they come from these like desperate provinces with unequal resources, and this is like a great equalizer to them. But they don't realize that, like, rich city, urban students have more resources to study for it and therefore do better. So it's like they really have that mindset where they see like affirmative action as like interference into this like otherwise fair and like neutral system. I think it's worth like breaking that illusion down for them and like educating them versus just like, talking about American history, which they don't know, like probably don't care. So yeah, I think that's like a useful.
Sort of explain affirmative action to them.
Yeah, like in terms that they can understand. Like it's the same debate in China. If you like talk about it that way, like I've talked about it with my mom. I'm like, she's against affirmative action, and like I have a really low SAT score, but I got into a really good school, and I'm like, the reason is because I wrote a really good essay. I did all these extracurriculars, and she's like, oh, like okay, like that makes more sense. Maybe like not having these like narrow metrics is the way to go. They think that Chinese people can just like work hard to achieve whatever they want, and that's how it should be. But like, if you make them realize that Chinese people are really diverse, have diverse talents, but not all of them are going to go through this process like successfully, and just breaking down the idea of merit and like affirmative action, how that plays into it. Like, I think could be helpful.
Yeah. So maybe just a different mindset and mentality that they're coming from, and so maybe speak on their terms as their perspective.
Yeah.
I'm curious about I don't know if you know anything about the income bracket of these conservative Chinese immigrants. I think actually about what you said too. I think that actually is something we're considering. I guess let me ask that first. Yeah. So do you know about the income brackets of those who tend to be against affirmative action?
I have. Well, I can just tell you that the individuals who have two districts that were protested, of the Asian members were very affluent individuals, affluent mainland Chinese, recent immigrant. Is sort of the demographic that we have seen as most vocal to it, but this is not done by poll, but just what we've seen anecdotally.
I mean, it's understandable that they would be against affirmative action because if they're recent immigrants, they were the ones who did, benefited from a very narrow system, just test
Yes.
scores.
Yes.
Yeah.
But that's what I'm saying. So many of us have. Well, what is the mind? Maybe it's a change in mindset because so many of us have benefited, but then also understand it's important for us to give back. And sometimes when we pay higher taxes, it might not be in our own self-interest, but have a benefit for the good or wider good. And so maybe it is that mentality from how they see it just philosophically on democracy and a system of government. To have that conversation and dialogue. But duly noted, maybe we can have a conversation with someone. It becomes very difficult because, like I said, when they're against disaggregated data and affirmative action and on LGBT issues, you sort of just say, okay, well, I'm just going to agree to disagree with you on some of these issues. But again, I don't want to give up. And because they are so vocal, it also gets the attention of mainstream media. And they like to capitalize on the divisions and saying, ooh, there's a division here. And then, of course, those in the more conservative Republican Party seize on that opportunity. So here, and it's real. There are no Latinos in the legislature who are Republican. There are no blacks in the legislature that are Republican. There are 5 Asian Republicans in the state legislature. So of the ethnic caucuses from Latino, African American, and Latino, there are 5 because the Republican Party said, "Ooh, we want to capture this feeling, this sentiment, and then push it forward." And unfortunately, that is the case that we see now. And that's why I go to the Democrat Party. I said, "Don't take AAPIs for granted. You take us for granted. You don't. Where's your voter registration outreach?" And we're always just an afterthought. No one, mainstream doesn't even think about us in this way. But that's why I think having public officials of AAPI descent to advocate for that is
What about other political parties, besides Democrat or Republican, with Asians and other political parties, Independent or Green? What about those? Are they also being kind of being taken for granted, or?
Generally speaking, we see that it's a 2-party system, and so the voter registration nationwide is still with the Democratic Party, but yet again, they are also a swing voter base in places like Virginia. So making sure that we articulate those values are important, but it just seems to be significant apathy. AAPIs don't vote according to their numbers. So if there can be more of a galvanizing issue, who knows? We've also seen, by the way, that if there's an AAPI candidate, that Asian Pacificers will cross partisan lines to vote for the Asian
Regardless of the party.
Generally speaking. So if you see an Asian survey, that Asians will typically vote for that Asian candidate. Typically, what the data shows, but that's not always the case.
So the API caucus are Republican and Democratic or just Democratic?
Our AAPI caucus is both Democrat and Republican. So that 15 consists of those 5 Republicans as well. But we also have more constitutional officers than in history. We have 3, which means that they are elected statewide, our state controller and our state treasurer. And as you may have seen, we also had a historic opportunity to elect our first Asian governor this past cycle. And John Chung, he was our state treasurer, but he did not get into the primary. And unfortunately, it was difficult to galvanize that component piece as well. So the nuanced issue is that there was a white candidate, there's a Latino candidate, and there's an Asian candidate. And this is the first time that the Asian candidate was viable. He was number 2 in fundraising, second to that of the future governor, $15 million raised in an election. And when you saw independent expenditures, outside group spending for the white candidate, you saw multi-million-dollars. For the Latino candidate, multi-million-dollars. And for the Asian candidate, $200,000. So part of it is just difficult, and I was part of trying to organize others to get involved and to say, look, we need to invest in this guy. And the feedback that I heard was, he's not liable, he's not going to win. I said, when is an Asian ever going to be the front runner? And you have to lay the groundwork for the future, because what's going to happen now? The next Asian candidate who dares be as bold as to run for governor, mainstream folks will say, you know what, the Asians won't rally around their person. The Latinos will, and the Caucasians will, but the Asians won't. So don't worry. They're only going to put up a paltry fight. So that is something that hopefully you can help with as well too, which is to help build capacity for things that we want to do.
Are you talking in context of the nation as a whole, or specifically in California?
Well, this was the race in California.
Oh, this is in California.
Yeah.
Okay.
This was the race in California. In other words, you had, for the 5th largest economy in the world, for the top spot, an Asian candidate running. Never before had you had an Asian running for that position who is viable, and yet Asians were nowhere to be found. So I sort of beat my head against the wall sometimes, saying, well, where is everybody? Do we need a crisis to get people to galvanize and say, okay, here's what we care enough about to go march in the streets and or go, at least basically go vote and or bring your person and or contribute $5 for this guy, because he's going to be representing our community as a whole.
I mean, I think part of the problem is, like, within the Democratic Party, a lot of people, so there's this quote from Cynthia Nixon who recently said that we have to be more than just a softer, more compassionate version of the Republican Party, and I think a lot of mainstream candidates, and I think a lot of Asian American candidates for office fall within that bracket, and there are a lot of people of color, Black, Latino, Cynthia Nixon was a white lesbian running for governor, and so the idea of like being different automatically making you disqualified or not viable as a candidate, I don't think is necessarily true. It's more, it's really important like what message are you bringing with you, and I think a lot of times with Asian Americans, like you're saying, they don't always have a clear message of what they stand for, and so, you know, we have people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right? There's so much excitement behind her. There's so many other Black women who have been winning primaries all across the country, and I think, you know, where are the Asian Americans who bring that same message? And I'm curious, like, where do you see yourself falling within the spectrum of the political spectrum of the Democratic Party? Yeah, where do you see yourself falling within that?
Yeah, it's a good question. Usually it's difficult. I personally don't like to be pigeonholed or identified in one way. In other words, we'll look at different issues, which is I then tell the story about what do I believe in, that as a product of public education all the way through, or that as mayor for a city, I can't afford to live in my own community. And you tell people that sort of like, oh, okay, you serve as mayor and the mayor can't even live, or a state legislator can't even afford a single family home in their own community. So what does that say about the millennial populations? Or that I said earlier that I can serve in public office, but yet I can't donate blood when we have a blood drive at the state capitol. Or that we are being subjected to the same type of discriminatory practices that occur. So those general philosophies of basic humanity, if we don't have the basic fundamentals of access to human capital, then how do we address these issues of equity in healthcare and in economic policies and all these other issues too? So those are the things that I think are important to address, and how you navigate some of those things. And unfortunately, it's been my observation that in this social media world and the rhetoric of just quick, people like you're either for or against. There's no gray area. And people say, well, if you waffle or you compromise, that's not seen as good. And there's something not inherently beneficial to that. And there's some ulterior motives, some nefarious sense to that. Whereas trying to find ground of commonality in the middle is important. Case in point, like on legislation, when on conversion therapy, I was able to talk to Republicans and get their support. Now, conservatives would say, how dare you compromise and support something like that and work with an openly gay legislator who continuously goes after the religious right. And yet, because Republicans have come on support of this, it changes the narrative completely, saying this is not a partisan issue. Love transcends partisanship. So how do we do that? And again, to that point, when we try to identify or put ourselves in a box and say, I'm going to be this leftist, or I'm a Bernie cracker, or whatever it is might be, or I'm a Hillary camp, it too simplifies the nature of the work that we do, which is very contextual, and it's very hard to get at. It's not just quick sound bites that people generally absorb. And unfortunately, I think that's oftentimes where people like myself and others also struggle, because if you can't deliver your message in that quick 5-second soundbite, or just see something on social media in a tweet, then you sort of lost that message. And how do you do that? So it takes effort to be able to build those relationships and rapport to create that message, which goes to your point. If you do not have a succinct message, then how do you relate and connect with individuals? At the same time, we also know that governance is messy, and it takes time to understand all of these wider issues. Yeah. But do you have a sense of, is that where you think it would be more helpful for maybe us in the API community to be a little bit more decisive in saying, okay, how do you make sure that you have an identifiable, quick and...
So like, I think someone like Maisie Hirono, who's been super vocal, like, I think we need more Asian Americans in office who will speak in that manner, right? Like, not being afraid to take a strong position.
Yeah.
And I think that type, like, I forget the name of the candidate who's running against Ted Cruz, who was asked a question.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and around Black Lives Matter, something like that, and he answered very directly, giving what would probably be an unpopular opinion to the crowd, but there's a point around like what Alexandria calls like moral clarity, and I think a lot of times with Asian Americans, particularly in elected office, there's this like wishy-washy, like we support education and our seniors, and I think that's a failure of the Democratic Party in general, where they don't want to seem controversial on things that are not controversial, right? So I think for our Asian American elected officials, like we need them to provide that kind of moral guidance and like leadership in taking these clear positions that really are not controversial in my opinion.
Yeah. So when are you gonna run?
I'm not.
You'd be perfect. Has anyone, I mean, from the network, from GAPIMNY ever sought to do that?
There aren't a lot of Asian American electeds in New York City.
There are not.
New York, yeah, New York City, yeah. There's really not a lot.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I
So-
don't think any of them are LGBTQ.
Okay. So, but as political co-chair, you're going to change that.
I'm on the advocacy side.
You're the advocacy side. Well, I mean, what is it? Why is that? I mean, that notion that there aren't that many AAI in New York. Is there a significant population of AAI here in New York?
There's a significant population here, and it's pretty big. I think
Grace Long.
but there's more like they spread out.
Oh.
She represents the Chinatown district, right?
No,
Grace
that's
is
Margaret
Queens,
Chan.
Queens.
Margaret Chen is.
Margaret Chan.
Margaret Chan is city council.
So
She knows
of those, for example, to see a little bit more, be more vocal on some of these issues that resonate, a little stronger. Not necessarily. Maybe this is a cultural thing. You know, maybe Asians, we like to stay kind of calm, keep to ourselves, and not really just throw bombs. Maybe there's a disconnect in trying to finesse the political narrative and what is required to galvanize the grassroots community.
I think like a concrete example, like similar to like the affirmative action issue, is regarding the specialized high schools here in New York City. There's been the mayor came out with a proposal to reform the admissions criteria, so it wouldn't just be based on this one SAT type test. And really, the Asian American elected officials in New York City have not been vocal. And John Liu, who was the New York City comptroller years years ago and ran for state senate seat in Queens, and he won the primary recently. But he, in the past, had expressed interest in admissions reform for specialized high schools, which have disproportionately been favorable for certain segments of the Asian American population. But recently, he's taken more of a more lukewarm position that we have to explore, like not really giving a clear position. I think a lot of Asian Americans in like leadership positions in the community feel like they don't know how to address that. And I think we need people who can take a clear position and do what you were saying you're doing in California, and just being very clear about why it's important that this current system isn't working. It's not fair. It's racial equity means this, and this is how it impacts our communities as well. And yeah, we need people who have like the moral leadership, the courage to take those positions.
Yeah. What about that at the national level? Are you aware of any group at the national levels? All the groups have like NAACP and there's HRC, strong advocacy groups at the national level to amplify our message. And for API, do you know one that you've been working with, or do you think it does a good job at saying advancing our message?
A lot of groups. I mean, there's Advancing Justice, there's All Deaf in New York. But I also think, I don't work at All Deaf, I don't know what their position really is, but I think a lot of people don't want to take the hits from coming strong on an issue where there's a lot of controversy. But I think that's important for us to do, and I think that's why at GAPIMNY we try to offer that. Let the community know like there are Asian Americans or LGBTQ folks who believe in this, and certain like conservative or Asian right-wing kind of positions don't reflect our values or our position.
Yeah. Well, it's one of those things where we saw separate groups of OCA and JCL and different things at the national level, but again, advancing all of us at the national vantage point is something that I've been thinking about. How do we create that? And certainly with the coast, these are constituencies, and so how do we do that? And what does that look like? So if we said, okay, from that we want to have our own pan-Asian group of HRC, what does that look like? And what are we going to demand and ask for? But that's why I think the convenings are really helpful, to try to understand and to listen to some of these other things too.
There was an interesting idea that was floated at our last general meeting by the speaker. So recently, in this past primary in New York, there was this group that formed called the Jewish Vote, and it was like sort of formed out of J. Fridge Jews for Economic Justice, racial economic justice, and they just sort of created this like shadow organization, is sort of too dark a term, but this sort of alternate organization that sort of decided to speak on behalf of the entire Jewish population and set a kind of clear moral agenda in relation to whatever the vote was, especially in relation to like Zionism and so forth, right? And the speaker was suggesting that we create a similar organization called the Asian Vote on the sort of the Asian American left, and decide to speak as, right, and for all of us, despite the fact that because the sort of information that gets filtered out into our communities is most often from like largely right-wing ethnic media, especially in the enclaves, I guess, in New York, right, and in New Jersey, where I'm from. And so to just have this alternative outlet of moral clarity and sort of clear positions would be, I don't know, I found the idea interesting.
And was there a movement when you're saying, oh, how do you replicate some of that? Because they're sort of one of the groups that we say is, how do you replicate the Jewish community impact of, they have the structures in place on advocacy and on organization and so much of that. So was there an interest, when you became aware of that and educated and informed on some of the background of that, was that something that maybe we should do?
I mean, I think there was immediate interest amongst us to sort of work towards that idea. there wasn't a lot of background conversation, but I do think it's interesting that historically the kinds of racialization and ethnicizations of the Jewish population in the United States and the Asian American population in the United States are like quite similar in a variety of ways, right? The racism that we face operates similarly. The kind of like access to economic resources at the same time as a kind of scapegoating at the level of like the nation state happens similarly. So I think as a model, there are reasons to believe that it would be a good model for the Asian community in the United States. And I do think, I don't think, as you're both saying, I don't think we're without infrastructure, right, to be able to do that. I just don't think the infrastructure is as connected as it could be, perhaps. And I don't think the infrastructure is as unapologetic as it could be, right? I think there's a way in which a kind of performance of non-compliance, a performance of certitude in the Asian American community is lacking and needs to be performed sort of doubly so in relation to the nation as a result of the ways that we're racialized as like meek and timid, right? I don't think we actually are, but I think that we have to compensate for that at the national level, at the political level, in order to make our voices heard in the same way that they're heard within racialized communities that are understood as already loud and already. You know what I mean?
So maybe replicating some of the best practices of some of the other groups as well too is something that we can do. Finding some partnerships and coalition building. Is the party structure pretty strong here? Like the respective Republican and Democratic parties, do they do anything?
Very strong.
Yeah. Do they do outreach to the respective communities?
I don't think so.
That's a no. Okay, so that's something else that maybe an area to work on. What about your on Crazy Rich Asians? Did the community here really get galvanized around that? Like I'm showing it, see it like
We tried to
multiple
see it,
times.
yeah.
I haven't seen it
like
yet, so like,
Oh, you have.
I'm still going to see it. I just haven't gone to the movies yet for a while because I have a very busy schedule, so please don't spoil it. I know it's been so hot in this.
Okay.
They were like giving free tickets out. It's fine. And one of our steering committee members pulled together some funds to help pay for tickets for people who wanted to go see it.
I would say there were significant isolated efforts, but
Do I see the accident?
yeah.
I can definitely tell you there have been a lot of mixed feelings. So within the Asian, that's from my own observation in regards to the movie.
Okay. And it's really the movie itself, but in terms of seeing a full cast,
So
in sort of seeing a full Asian cast,
yeah.
you know, seeing that issue, at least what I observed back in California is that was good. Oh, let's go out and see it 3 times. Let's see it 4 times. Bring your family, bring your friends. Oh, great. Let's do this also in civic engagement too.
See, also, you know, with Crazy Rich Asians, it's like this is all like focused like on like the Chinese culture, and you know how diverse the Asian American, or I mean just Asians in general are.
Yeah.
And yeah, and then I see a lot of especially like many like Southeast Asian communities, like you know they have like their own take on the movie, like you know I see not so good you know reviews, not reviews, but like you know about how it's not, you know how it's like not representing Asians well, or you know all those kind of issues.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the things that the movie does is like kind of perform a contradiction that you brought up earlier that is also constantly performed in GAPIMNY, which is the contradiction inherent in the fantasy that Asian American is like a category that is real. You know what I mean? Which is why I'm really heartened to hear that you're as invested in disaggregation of data as you are, because I think that that's crucial. I think, right, like speaking as a Filipino American, right, the issues that I would bring forth would be about sort of demilitarizing the Philippines, right, in relation to the United States. But within the context of an Asian American frame, that would never rise to the front of a list of priorities, right, despite how urgent it might be. So I think that the first step from my point of view would be disaggregation. And then, I mean, strategically that would allow you to sort of like stiff arm the conservative Chinese community to say this is actually, it's not about you.
Yeah,
like
yeah,
that.
right.
We love your support, but
Yeah.
it's about these other people.
Right.
So that's what I would say about that. And I'm also heartened to hear the kind of support for ethnic studies, and I think Asian American studies specifically, because we're talking so much about the ways that recent immigrants and their children, right, come with fantasies of meritocracy and so forth. And that's kind of a bit like, we have this general education series within GAPIMNY because it's one of our ways of trying to deal with that contradiction, right? Of a kind of mostly East Asian contingency or a loudly East Asian contingency of people that carry similar biases, right? And so it would seem that ethnic studies, the kinds of education, like that's the answer that we've come to here as an issue and a method.
We've readily recognized that coming together as a coalition, as a brighter API has been helpful, but it also comes with its consequences and its inability to achieve certain outcomes as well. I think that's where the remember, as I mentioned too, is a very candid conversation where across the board sitting around the table, I said, great, a decade ago we said we just want to get Asians elected because we wanted representation. That's all we wanted, representation, just be there. Okay, well now that we're there, what are we asking? And what are we delivering to the communities that we represent? That is identifiable and saying, okay, if you weren't there as an API, this would have never been done. That is fundamentally at the core as to why we are what we're trying to figure out. But I think we're honestly, I said we had a retreat. I said we have an identity crisis. How do we deliver something? And but these are difficult conversations, but ones that need to be had. Just like, oh no, everything's great. Asians don't do anything. We're like perfect. We're just like a minority. Everything's great. We expect more from ourselves.
I just wanted to make sure we have time for this question I'm going to ask. So some of our members reached out to us when they heard that we were having a speak. And as you know, earlier this summer, your campaign took some money from the GEO group. From GEO group. That is basically a nice private prison contractor, right? And so these are some of our members who reached out are people who are undocumented, who are Chinese, Korean, and so forth. They're part of the Asian American community, even though we oftentimes don't think of our community as being affected by some of these immigration policies. So I just wanted to give you an opportunity to respond to some of the concerns about your campaign having taken that money. And I know since then you donated that money to I think it's Asian American Social Services Organization or some sort of Asian American nonprofit. So I just wanted to give you the opportunity to respond to those concerns.
Yeah. When I first heard about this, I said to myself, what is GEO group? I had no idea. So process-wise, sort of how campaigns are run is check go straight to the treasurer and they just cash them, so we don't even know. But when I heard about this, and I said, what is GEO group? I said, what is GEO group? I didn't know what it was. And then I found out what they had done. And I said, okay, this is not consistent with my values. Let me do due diligence. And so I was asking questions that took time, which was to this extent, where did this money come from? Who is the representative that was attributed to this? What exactly are the bad cases towards those that are undocumented and LGBTQ the atrocity towards that? And then letting me have an opportunity to have a conversation with the representative at GEO group to hear their side of the story and get their take on it. That took time, and ultimately those resources were donated to AMKI, Asian Americans for Community Development, that focuses on survivors of torture, specifically for that. So that was basically what had happened. But I think part of the challenge that exists is that there's a sense of immediacy that we want action. Like, what is this about? And I also would just caution in the public setting that of what is that of campaign contributions and how does democracy, how are campaigns run? Fundamentally, I believe in public financing of campaigns, and support legislation has gone nowhere for public financing of campaigns. But having said that, this is the system that we abide by. When you look at the campaign contributions that we receive, it goes to supporting and electing more Democrats so that we can have an opportunity to pass the piece of legislation that we want to. So again, I just sort of have a caution when we talk about community members about campaign contributions, because we might say, okay, no, you shouldn't take campaign contributions from Facebook because Cambridge Analytica, or you're not going to take campaign contributions from a labor union or a teacher association or whatever it else might be. And fundamentally that implies that there is a corrosive nature towards campaign contributions, which should also get money out of politics so that you don't have the public taxpayer dollars going to spend on people. So that's kind of that notion of what's going on. And I sort of said tongue-in-cheek the other day to someone, I said, I will take the devil's money to do God's work, because I believe we're on the side of the angels. But for many people, it is just very purist. We don't want you to be taking e-contributions from anybody, and that's a view that other people are taking, no PACs, no corporate contributions. But I say, my belief is using those resources to advance the interests that we have together. So anyway, that's
So you partly addressed this earlier that you were doing your due diligence after you found out about the contribution. I think there was also some concern that it took you longer than some of the other LGBT caucus
Yeah.
elected officials who had put out statements, kind of announcing their contributions and doing what they did with the funding. And so, can you speak to that just a little bit more? Because it was, I think, really upsetting for a lot of people. Like,
Sure.
even at the GAPIMNY conference, I think if it wasn't for that issue, I think a lot more people would have been excited to hear you speak. But there was, I don't know if you could sense it from where you were standing, but there were a lot of people in the audience who were upset because at that point, your office had issued a statement. And so I think it took another week or two afterwards.
Yeah. They were just quick and said, we don't even want to touch this. They just said, we're going to immediately do it. And I said, I want to do due diligence and do it. So it's a different approach to it. And so the context was that, exactly that. They don't even want to touch and even find out where it came from. We just want it gone altogether. And then alternatively, I remember I had a conversation with other individuals and they said, if I received campaign contributions from the NRA, but I had an F minus continuously, which I do, is that a bad thing? So I don't know, what would you say? Should I take campaign contributions from NRA and yet I vote against them consistently every single time I have an opportunity and vocally go against them? What would you say to that? The average person, I think, would say, no, we don't want you to take that money because it feels icky. But the reality is, our democracy and campaigns requires the resources to communicate and to get electorally other people elected office. So I say that because I suggest doing the harder work to say, well, what is the track record? What is the voting record? So for example, on ICE, I go out and I protested outside of ICE immigration raids. I've spoken out and supported resolution language on similar issues like that. But I think that's where the hard work needs to happen. And not just for that soundbite, and look, take a deeper dive, like do research and understand what was this about. Because I think there's a dangerous nature to social media and immediacy of things, because it's just, you read something and then you jump to your conclusion and that's it. And unfortunately, that's the era that we live in. But that's why I think there's an obligation for me to be out and coming here and to talk to people and being listening and saying, well, what are people hearing? What's going on, so that I can have a better sense of how to best navigate and also communicate in an effective manner. But anyway, I'm curious. What would you say? So if someone was to say, I'm going to take NRA money, but I vote consistently against them, and I have F- proudly, and I want them completely gone, but I'll still take their money. Well, or I will take.
So I appreciate like that you're answering the question. I just think it's hard to measure like whether it does have an impact or not. You can vote no on a piece of legislation, but if you had not taken that money, would you have taken more proactive measures to introduce other legislation? You know, I mean, it's hard to quantify like the impact of taking money from these lobbying groups, and so yeah, I just think it's hard to quantify, and you can point to an F- record, but you know, maybe there's even more that would have been done if you didn't take that money. You know, I'm not saying you specifically, but you never. It's hard to quantify.
And part of the sausage making, unfortunately, and I'll just tell it as it is that when you look at campaign contributions from any politician you take a look at, you'll see that it's reflective of society, that there are different issues from this wide variety of society. But that's why when I say NRA money or take fossil fuel money, fossil fuels from Chevron, that you vote against them 90% of the time, or whatever the issue might be, then understanding how our democracy is functioning, but then understanding the deep values of the individual, like what does this person stand for, fundamentally, what do they stand for, and how do they reflect that in not only just with legislation, but where the money, where the putting their money where their mouth is, in terms of advocacy. But I think that's a fair assessment, and I think one that is saying, okay, how do we make sure that people feel like the system of governance works for them? Because that's why I think people think politics is terrible. They don't trust the system, and that people are unduly influenced by campaign contributions and or special interests. And the reality is that is absolutely the case, in which why we're seeing public financing campaigns and trying to get out of it. But that's the system we have now, and how do you make sure that you can call it as it is, and be able to explain some of these things? Because we are also held to a higher standard. So while that's a position that I believe, there are also the issues of optics. The optics is that of reality, and so making sure that you have an understanding of that is also equally important, because we are held to a higher standard.
Can you speak a little bit more to what you're doing in California regarding what's happening around immigration with ICE detention centers? We know that disproportionately it impacts Southeast Asian communities within the broader API community. We know that the way trans people are treated in these detention centers are awful. People are dying. They're locked up in solitary. And so what are you doing, if anything, or what can you do, and that you can share with us?
Yeah, I've co-authored legislation that would prevent any state resources using to work in collaboration with ICE on any type of raids for no fault of individuals known. So ICE, we will not cooperate if you go into churches, places of worship, schools, parks, any of the things alike, because we will not use public taxpayer dollars to subsidize this type of attack on Californians and our people, and people who are coming here for the American dream just like everyone else. And oftentimes when I talked about the historical context too, my family also came to the United States and California illegally through what we call paper sons. There was a big major fire in San Francisco, and so all the documentation was completely burned down. So my grandfather had to go through immigration in Angel Island and talk about why he believed he was nationalized, or he grew up in this community, and had to tell the immigration officer how many stairs there were in the household. So when we talk about the vantage point of immigration, it's important to respect our own identity, that this is not just coming from some other Latino group, but that Southeast Asians in our own communities come from that as well too. So again, that piece of legislation, which was Senate Bill 54, the only state in the nation that has passed legislation of that kind that would say we're going to codify and go a different direction than that of the federal administration. Similarly, we're looking at additional piece of legislation in the coming years to further codify, making sure that we do not continually support that of the immigration raids that we have, but then also the privatization of our prisons. And so we are very much focused on a number of issues with respect to criminal justice reform, and making sure that those that are trying to struggle for the American and California dream, just like everybody else, do not be penalized for the same things that other communities have gone through before too. So it's a continual effort that the Asia Pacific, when you talk about actually about the issues that we all 10 of us, not the Republicans, 10 of us have all adopted, that has been a caucus priority, that we want to make sure that we create a safe and inclusive space for everyone. So we continue to do that, and working with Asian Americans Advancing Justice and CAPIMNY and all these other groups as well too. So it's a very good effort that we feel like is working well, but we need to continue to do more, because the other thing is that we've heard from other states and other legislators who have said, how do we do the same thing, and how do we replicate some of these things? And I'll tell you that it is also not electorally popular to support some of these measures, but it's the right thing to do, which is to say that the conservatives have gone out with a lot of law enforcement groups to say this will increase crime, and that there will be more criminal activity in your neighborhoods, and public safety issues are the bread and butter of electoral politics. But yet we just believe that we are on the right side of these issues. And so again, I would suggest that that's a bold position that the Asia Pacific Caucus has taken, and but we can do more and be much more vocal about it as well. Yeah. So I guess I'm running out of time, but it is. So what would you think would be important or helpful to see if you were to say, okay, if you're at match one, what issues do you think what should be done from the opinions standpoint? Is it like, look, we have our own, we can do what we want in the mayor's office or in the governor's office. What type of things would like to be changed? So end by asking that question. Say, okay, if we were to have electoral success, like, okay, what is it that we're going to ask them for? Sort of talked about some of these issues with respect to those that are striving for the American and California dream in our communities and equal access, just like everybody else, equal opportunity.
long. I mean, like single payer,
Okay.
universal K through 12 ethnic studies.
Anything on the progressive left agenda.
Okay.
The abolition of ICE. Prisons.
And you know, one of those things too is when we hold these values. I also struggle because when I talk to other counterparts in other states, they said, "You coastal people, you liberal elites don't understand." And it's one where again I think being able to listen, and even not only just in the coastals, even if you go to the Central Valley in California, you can hear it and you can see it. I mean, these Democrats are very pro NRA and pro firearms, so they don't go with us on this. And they continually tell us and yell at us. And we're in the state capitol. They go, "We can't join you guys because you don't understand what it's like to be in rural America, even in California, where we have ag issues. And we talk about the environment and going against fossil fuels, but we have oil fields in our communities. How do you do that? And by the way, these are providing jobs to people of color. So how dare you?" So it's this, it's just growing pains. But I've been having those straight conversations and understanding those values and being able to articulate why affirmative action is going to be beneficial and why talking about the issues of universal health care would have a benefit for the wider good, I think is important. So I very much would welcome your input and your engagement on some of these things because I'm hopeful that we can continue to change the conversation. But again, specifically from the lens of the AAPIs, because galvanizing our community to me is very important right now. In my observation of the absence of us collectively as a whole, but I'm also excited about the greatest potential because we can get there, but it'll just take some time to go through.
So just a couple quick thoughts. Like, Republicans vote against the self-interest of their constituents all the time. We talk about like living wage, like all kinds of stuff, healthcare. So they do it all the time, but they're able to message it,
Yeah.
and they're able to draw on xenophobia, whatever, like the tools that they have. And so I think on the Democratic side or the left or whatever you want to call it, I think people need to be able to message better, to have moral clarity, and like be able to explain an issue, or I just think we can do better. I think just to say, oh well, there's oil fields in our backyard, so we can't take a better position on environmental justice. I don't really buy it, especially when people are probably dying from cancer or their water being polluted. Like, there's all kinds of other issues that go into that, and I think we need to be better about speaking to it. And I think also, like, our communities are diverse, and so I hear you, like, trying to get us to prioritize, and I think that's, we are a diverse community or communities, and so I think that's part of the strength, and I think we shouldn't shy away from that. Like, we're multi-issue because we don't live single-issue lives, and I think we need to draw on that. And I think a lot of the people that we see coming up on the Democratic Party who are people of color, like, that's a big part of the messaging around racial and economic and social justice and blah, 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 blah. And I think we need to embrace that and not shy away from that.
Yeah, very good. Well, I appreciate the time and opportunity to be with you. And if you're ever out, please don't hesitate to let us know, because we want to create a strong network and making sure that we're also trading notes on the things, because there are many similarities on the things that we're working on. So thank you. Yeah, thank you very much.